I've owned a lot of bandsaws over the years, from the cheap to the high end. Right now there are 5 saws in this shop. We have a Delta, a Jet, a Rikon, and 2 Harveys. There are a lot of differences from one saw to the next, particularly the Harveys, which are a pleasure to work with. We'll do a comparison video in the coming weeks so you know what to look for if you're in the market for a new or even a used saw. But today I want to focus on one of the most common questions I get about bandsaws. What type of blade guides are the best? Our saws have a little bit of everything. We have one with steel blocks, another with cool blocks, and 3 different types of bearing guides. In a moment we'll cover the pros and cons of all of these, but first you need to know what bandsaw guides actually do. Without guides, when you turn your workpiece, the kerf of the wood would simply pinch on the blade and twist it. This would make it difficult to cut curves with anything but the narrowest blades. Guides help nudge the blade back on track, keeping it straight as you turn the wood so that you can make the curved cut. This makes controlled curve cutting possible. In theory, bandsaw guides are not supposed to be a factor when you're making straight cuts, such as resawing thick boards into thinner ones. Theoretically, you can make those straight cuts with no guides on the saw at all, because a blade that's properly tracking and tensioned should not drift to the right or to the left. In fact, your guides should be set about a 32nd of an inch away from the blade so they make no contact with it when the saw is running straight. I say theoretically though, because no matter how hard you try to cut a perfectly straight line, even if you use a fence, your blade will rub on the guides, because small variations in your feed, slight tilting of the workpiece, the natural opening of the kerf as you make a cut, all of these things put pressure on the blade and move it a little bit to the right or to the left where it can contact the guides. Those guides may not be as much of a factor in keeping your cut straight as they are when you're cutting curves, but they will become a factor in keeping your blade cool. So the wrong guides can affect your saw's performance even if you only use the saw for resawing, as I do with the larger of my 2 Harvey saws. Now that you understand the role of bandsaw guides and how important they are to your saw's performance, what are the pros and cons of each type available to you? Should you consider upgrading to a different kind than you have already, or even a different saw? Let's start with steel guide blocks. These are the type that came on older saws for decades. Steel is hard, so they last a long time. But steel creates a tremendous amount of friction, which wears on the blade itself, it heats it up, and it shortens its life. If you have steel blocks and you break a lot of blades, or your blade seems to dull quickly, you may be surprised how much more life you can get from your blades if you upgrade your guides. A lot of folks upgrade to what are called cool blocks. They like these because they're inexpensive and they sometimes can be easily retrofitted to some older saws that came with steel blocks. Cool blocks are made from a hard phenolic material that's impregnated with graphite, which acts as a lubricant to reduce friction. These wear less on the sides of your blades, which can reduce breaks, and they help your blades stay cooler so it doesn't dull as quickly. The downside is cool blocks are softer than steel, so the blocks themselves will wear out more quickly. And they can wear unevenly, which makes it more difficult to follow your cut lines. But you can true them up again with sandpaper if this becomes an issue. Cool blocks are especially useful if you use 3/16 or narrower blades, because you could just cover the entire side of the blade, teeth and all, with the block without the risk of damaging the teeth. Another popular option these days are ceramic blocks. These combine some of the low friction benefits of cool blocks with a harder wearing material. But like steel guides, if the side of your blade's teeth ever comes in contact with a ceramic guide block, you may as well throw the blade in the trash. It's never going to cut straight again. So you have to set them carefully, especially with narrow blades. Ceramic blocks can also create sparks. And while I assume it's very rare, I have heard some reports of smoldering sawdust inside bandsaws. It's worth noting that some folks make their own guide blocks from hardwood. Domestic woods are sometimes soaked in oil to add lubrication, and some exotic woods are not only extremely hard, but they also contain natural lubricating oils. These would function very much like those cool blocks we talked about, with the same pros and cons. These days, it seems that most mid-range and high-end bandsaws come with ball-bearing guides. These improve on the guide blocks in some ways, but the quality of the bearings makes a big difference. They're not all created equal. You get what you pay for. The biggest benefit of guides is they nearly eliminate friction. It's the difference between dragging something across the floor and putting it on wheels. The latter is a much smoother way to go. Less friction means fewer broken blades and teeth that stay sharp longer. Sharp teeth are perhaps the most important factor when cutting thick materials, especially resawing boards. If you struggle to resaw straight, it might be that your blade is dull. If your blade gets dull quickly, it's likely from friction. Bearing guides were designed to solve these problems. But some lower-end guides use poor quality bearings that wear out quickly and they can be expensive to replace. And they can also be noisy. Another factor to consider is how easy they are to adjust. Some can be extremely frustrating. You get it right where you want it, and then when you tighten it down, the bearing moves out of position. That's one of the things I like about this Harvey bandsaw. The locking mechanism is on the side of the guide rather than on the bearing itself, like it is on this saw. That makes them so much easier to adjust. And don't think this is a small feature. It can be the difference between a quick 2-minute blade change and 15 minutes of frustration. Of course, toolless guides are well worth the extra price as well. I don't think I would buy a bearing guide without them. There are some downsides to ball bearing blade guides though. For one thing, they can be a little noisy, especially the cheaper ones. And if you're a wood turner who cuts a lot of wet green wood, you'll find that the dust can get mashed between the bearing and the blade, causing it to stick in places. Hard compressed clumps of sawdust can throw your guides out of adjustment, which isn't that big of a deal when you're cutting your bowl blanks, but you will have to readjust them if you plan to do finer cuts later. Guide blocks, on the other hand, act as scrapers, which keep the sawdust from building up. Is that important to you? You'll have to decide based on what type of work you do most. Really, that's what it comes down to with any of these guides, because they'll all work to one degree or another. The only guides I wouldn't recommend are the old steel blocks. They're just too hard on your blades. Cool blocks reduce friction and won't damage the blade's teeth if they come in contact with it, but they wear a little bit faster and sometimes unevenly. Ceramic blocks last a long time, but they can be hard on the blade's teeth, so you have to be careful, especially with narrow blades. Bearing guides virtually eliminate blade-killing friction, but you have to get the right ones or they can be frustrating to set up and noisy to use. The bottom line is, don't let someone tell you that one type of guide is the be-all and end-all. Before you upgrade your saw or before you choose a new saw, consider the pros and cons of each type, because the right guides can make a big difference. Wait, don't go yet. If you're new here, please subscribe and remember to ring the bell. I would really appreciate that. Give us a thumbs up, or better yet, leave us a comment. I always read them. And be sure to check out the latest issue of Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal. It's always packed with tips, tricks, and tutorials designed to make you a better woodworker.